For thousands of years, humans lived without kings. No crowns, no palaces, and no one sitting above everyone else. So when did humans decide to obey one person? How did one ordinary human become more powerful than everyone else? The answer may have started with a simple problem. When danger appeared, someone had to make a decision. Maybe the best hunter spoke first, or maybe it was the person who knew where to find food. But being a leader was not the same as being a king. So what changed? And how did leaders become kings? At first, most human groups were small. Everyone usually knew everyone else, and nobody needed a giant government. But then, human groups began to grow, and suddenly, things became more complicated. More people meant more food was needed, and more food meant more competition. Someone had to decide who got what, and that gave some people something new, something humans had never experienced before: real power. But power creates a dangerous question. Who should control all of this? The strongest person could take control, but strength alone was not enough. A leader also needed people to trust him, and trust could slowly become loyalty. Then came another problem. Other human groups wanted the same land. Now the tribe needed someone to organize everyone. And in times of danger, leaders became more important than ever. But now, leadership was starting to change. Before, a leader only guided the group when needed, but now, people started looking to the same person every day. He decided where people would live. He helped decide who would do which job, and people began accepting his decisions. Slowly, his influence became something much bigger. But influence alone does not make a king. To become a king, power had to survive, and that is when everything began to change. For a long time, leadership was temporary, but eventually, some leaders stayed in power. People began to see them as different, not just as a helper. They started seeing them as the person in charge. Then, another idea appeared. What if power could stay in one family? That changed the rules completely. Now, leadership could become permanent, and one family could remain above everyone else. But keeping power was not easy. Not everyone wanted to obey. So leaders needed a way to protect their power, and one powerful tool was fear. Another was control over food. If you controlled the food, people depended on you. But there was an even more powerful idea. What if the gods had chosen the leader? Now, disobeying him could feel dangerous, because now his power seemed greater than human. And power became even stronger when people believed it was sacred. But beliefs alone could not build a kingdom. To rule more people, leaders needed more organization. They needed people who could carry out their decisions. And slowly, a new system began to appear. Some people collected food and resources. Others protected the settlement. And some people began working only for the leader. The leader was no longer doing everything alone. For the first time, power was becoming a system. But power had another side. The more power one person had, the more others wanted it. And now, leadership could become a struggle. One leader could not control everything forever. So he needed loyal people around him, people who would protect his position, people who benefited from his power, and people who wanted him to stay in charge. Slowly, power began protecting itself, and that made removing a leader much harder. But power still had one major weakness. What happened when the leader died? Who would take his place? Without a clear answer, chaos could begin. So some societies found a simple solution. The leader's child could become the next leader. Now, power could pass from one generation to the next. And leadership became something you could inherit. This was a huge change, because now, power could stay in the same family for generations. But a ruling family needed something else. People had to believe the family deserved power. So rulers created powerful stories. Stories about great ancestors. Stories about brave leaders. And stories about why their family was special. The story made their power feel natural. And slowly, fewer people questioned it. But stories were only part of the secret, because a ruler also needed wealth. And wealth came from one simple thing: surplus. For the first time, people could produce more food than they could eat immediately, and that extra food could be stored. But whoever controlled the storage controlled something valuable, and valuable things attract powerful people. Soon, leaders could reward loyal supporters. More loyalty meant more control, and more control brought even more wealth. It became a powerful cycle. The more power a ruler gained, the easier it became to gain even more. But as rulers became richer, society began to change too. Some people now had more resources than others, and some families became more powerful than everyone else. Power was no longer just about being strong. Now it was about controlling people and resources, and that required rules. Rules about food, rules about land, and rules about who had authority. And slowly, leadership became something much bigger. This was no longer just a tribe. It was becoming something entirely new. A society with rulers, officials, and people whose entire job was to manage everyone else. Power was becoming organized, and organized power could control much larger groups of people. The ruler no longer needed to know everyone personally. Now, the system worked for him. But there was still one final problem. How could one ruler control an even larger territory? The answer was to divide power. Trusted people were sent to manage different areas. They collected resources, they enforced the ruler's decisions, and they reported everything back to the center. The ruler was creating a network of power, and that network made his authority reach farther than ever before. Now, a simple leader had become something much more powerful. But was he finally a king? Not quite. A true king needed something more. His power had to be recognized by everyone, not just by his closest followers, but by an entire society. And that recognition needed to continue from one generation to the next. That was the moment power became an institution. And from that idea, the first true kings could rise. But this is where the story becomes even more surprising. There probably was no single moment when someone suddenly said, "From today, I am officially the first king." Instead, kingship developed slowly, over hundreds and thousands of years. Different societies created kings in different ways. Some kings gained power through war, others gained power through wealth, and some gained power because people believed they were chosen by the gods. But in every case, the same basic ingredients appeared. A leader needed resources. He needed loyal supporters. He needed a way to keep control. And people needed to accept his authority. Put all of those things together, and you have the foundation of a king. So, how did the first king become king? Not because someone simply gave him a crown. He became king because society slowly gave power a permanent shape. And that is how a simple leader slowly became a king.